Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Q. Jesus spoke to his disciples, "Don't be anxious about your life. Don't worry about getting enough food or having clothes to wear. Life means more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Look at the birds of the heavens. They don't plant seeds or gather a harvest. They have neither storehouses nor barns, yet God feeds them. Aren't you more important than birds? Can any of you, for all your worrying, add a single moment to your life? If worry can't change the smallest thing, then why be anxious about the rest? Look at the lilies that grow wild in the fields. They don't weave clothes for themselves. But I tell you, even King Solomon, in all his splendor, was not dressed as beautifully as these flowers. If that is how God clothes the grasses, which are green today and burned in the sun tomorrow, how much more will God provide for you? How little faith you have. Don't be blinded by the pursuit of food, clothing, and possessions. Stop worrying about these things. Only those who lack spirit would pursue them. You have a Father who knows what you need. Set your heart on God, and all these things will be given to you." A gospel inspired by God. A few months ago, somebody sent me an email with an attachment. And the attachment was a video clip from the Jay Leno show. And it was called Jaywalking. Some of you have seen it perhaps? And in this, I had never seen it before, he goes out into public with a microphone and he's interviewing people on the street about history, various kinds. Now, I'm hoping and I'm presuming that he's picking the dumbest and the funniest of the responses he got, because if that's what our education level is like at the moment, we're in big, big trouble here in this country. So he got up to one guy and he says, "Who fiddled while Rome burned?" Who fiddled while Rome burned? Fiddled? Fiddled? Fiddled with what? What was the name of the ship on which the pilgrims arrived? It landed at Plymouth Rock. It has the same name as a famous moving company. Oh, the U-Haul. Name two of the founding fathers. Founding fathers? The founding fathers of what? What do you know about the Gettysburg Address?
Abraham Lincoln.
Gettysburg Address. Have you heard of it? Sure, I've heard of it. I mean, I can't tell you the exact location or the zip code, but I've heard of it. He points, there's a big American flag flying over a building, in the wind, and he says to this lady, "How many stars on that flag?" "I can't count them, it's moving too fast." Who was the first man on the moon? Armstrong? Very good. What was his first name? Louis? The Irish equivalent of that, when I was a small kid, was a book that was called The Comic History of Ireland. And it was a book in which answers were culled from examination papers that kids had written in. And it was absolutely hilarious. But when kids are in examination conditions, in Ireland particularly, in the absence of erudition, you have to try to, impress the examiner with your patriotism. And so it becomes really, really important that your patriotism comes out. You may have no answers to the questions, but you have to respond to every question with the following remark. Who was St. Patrick? St. Patrick died in 461. He was the greatest Irishman that ever lived. Who was Brian Boru? Brian Boru died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian Boru was the greatest Irishman that ever lived. Who was Daniel O'Connell? Daniel O'Connell died in 1847. Daniel O'Connell was the greatest Irishman that ever lived. Who was Charles Stewart Parnell? Charles Stewart Parnell died in 1891. Charles Stewart Parnell was the greatest Irishman that ever lived. Who was Padraig Pearse? Padraig Pearse died in 1916. Padraig Pearse was the greatest Irishman that ever lived. So you hope that by protesting your patriotism, that overlooked the fact that you had no information about the topic. Now, I'm going to feel a little bit like that at the end of today's homily, because I want to talk about spiritual practices which are really important for our times and for the transformation of our world. And I'm going to give the impression, as I talk about each one of them, that this particular spiritual practice is the single most important spiritual practice you should be engaged in. And then I'm going to say that about a whole bunch of them. So forgive me in advance for it. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I will talk about, I call it crisis as opportunity. The second one I will call self-monitoring. Thirdly, I'll talk about the practice of the present moment. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about nature as our greatest teacher. So the first piece, crisis as opportunity. You certainly don't have to be a rocket scientist or be even au fait with Irish history or American history to realize that we live at a time of history in a world situation which is in the greatest crisis planet Earth has ever witnessed, certainly in the time of the hominids. It's the time of the greatest crisis ever. We're looking at economic issues, a confluence of a whole bunch of crises, economic issues, ecological issues, possibly of nuclear holocaust, overpopulation, devastation of our environment, toxicity in our streams, in our air, in our land, hunger, disease, poverty of all kinds. There has never been a stage of human history in which the crisis has been so profound. Now the question is, what is this about? Are we just going to give up about this? We're going to bury our heads in the sand and go off, climb a mountain and meditate? Is that the response to it? When you look, in fact, at the evolution of our cosmos, and you look at the evolution of our planet, you realize again and again and again that in the absence of either cosmic crises or global crises, the planet or the universe does not make significant quantum shifts in functioning. I'll give you 2 simple examples, one a cosmic one and one a global one. In the very first nanoseconds or after the Big Bang, as this little infant universe was coming to being, there was a huge immediate crisis because it was spitting out, for every particle of matter that it was spitting out a particle of antimatter. And when matter and antimatter meet, they literally annihilate each other. So it looked like the entire experiment was going to fizzle out immediately. And many of them do. According to quantum mechanical theory, there are 10 to the power of 27 brand new universes created every second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. And many of these, they fizzle out. Mathematically, they fizzle out. So it looked like this universe of ours was going to fizzle out. And then some intelligence somewhere behind the system made a slight tweak. And for every 1 billion particles of antimatter, there was 1,000,000,001 particle of matter. And from that tiny imbalance, 1 part in a billion, everything we see around us was created. And so the cosmos itself responded to this cosmic crisis by tweaking the system sufficiently to create everything we have around us. Look at the history of our planet itself, the evolution of the planet. We're about 4.5 billion years of age. 0.8 billion years into the process, the planet threw up life for the first time. So 3.7 billion years ago, the very first life forms came into being, protozoa and bacteria. Now, bacteria love hydrogen, which is good news, because hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. 90% of what stuff in the universe is hydrogen. So the bacteria made a very wise choice. They chose a foodstuff which was available everywhere. And they were very, very good engineers. Bacteria learned how to take hydrogen from the sun directly, how to take it from rocks and soil, and they finally discovered how to take it from water. Now the problem was this: water is H2O. If you extract the 2 hydrogen molecules from water, you're left with oxygen. And oxygen is totally poisonous to bacteria. Totally poisonous. So they were killing themselves as they were feeding themselves. And this struggle went on actually for 1.5 billion years. Bacteria killing themselves by taking oxygen from water, by taking hydrogen from water, thus releasing oxygen, which was poisonous and toxic to them. Until finally, they come with a brilliant solution, a very elegant solution. It was the creation of mitochondria. And mitochondria is that part of the cell which not only is oxygen not a poison to it, it's a food stuff for it. So the very first marriage on our planet was between cells and mitochondria. The cell, being the male, said to the female mitochondria, I will give you shelter and a house if you come to live within me, but you've got to cook for me and keep house for me. That was the agreement. The mitochondria migrated to the interior of the cell, and it breaks down oxygen, and oxygen becomes the life force of all the mammals. So here was a great, huge global shift. So every time we're faced with a great crisis, there's an opportunity for this extraordinary leap. And so when I look at the crisis in which we find ourselves at this stage, and it's the greatest crisis we've experienced in the history of humanity, what's the invitation? The invitation is to really stretch and make a quantum shift in our functioning. Now when you look at just even over the last 2,000 years, where we have been moving and shifting. Up to the 1500s, literally, we lived in a paradigm and in a mindset in which everything was very, very organized by a god at the top of a hierarchy, and under him was the Pope and the kings, and then lesser rulers, and then basically men, and on the very, very bottom, women and children. And everything revolved about planet Earth. Planet Earth was the center, and there were a whole bunch of nested spheres around it in which the sun and the moon and the stars lived, and God was above this system. It was a real organized, mechanistic system. And then Copernicus blew the whistle on it and pointed out that all the ways in which we try to explain the orbits of the planets and the stars, it didn't really make sense looking at a geocentric model, looking at a model in which the Earth was the center. It made much more elegant sense looking at a heliocentric model, a model in which the sun was the center. And he revised all of the equations. Some years later, Galileo invented the telescope, and he had no empirical proof of what Copernicus had talked about. So there's this huge shift is beginning to happen. Along came Descartes, and Descartes split up science into the mind and to the machine. Newton would give us the laws of how this machine worked. And then Darwin would come along and kick us further out of the center, because not only is the Earth not the center of the whole system, human beings aren't even the center of the Earth. We're simply one line in the evolutionary process. And then Freud put the kibosh on it completely in claiming that we're basically these little creatures who are full of sexual desire and aggression, and we have to kind of censor it with super egos of various kinds. Now, this gave birth to the Industrial Revolution and to extraordinary technology, which liberated us from the church, liberated us from the dictatorship of church thinking. But over 400 years, it's created all the technological garbage and all of the pollution and all the toxicity and much of the poverty and disease that we witness in our planet today. It took us out of one situation very elegantly and created another, because spirit wants to keep moving. So beginning perhaps in the 1960s in our own time, there was a move into a totally different kind of a mindset in which we're beginning to realize that we live in a conscious universe, a very elegant conscious universe that lives and breathes and has intelligence. That we're all part of one family, and by one family I do not just mean all Americans or even all human beings, but all sentient life, wherever it is going to be found in the universe. And therefore our responses to this must be a response of reverence and love for all the players in it. And therefore the only stance faced with this extraordinary crisis is transformation. Two kinds of transformation, it seems to me. Personal transformation, individual by individual, and the transformation of institutions and organizations and models. Economic models, political systems, medical models, educational models, agricultural models. And I want to illustrate this by an example from my own experience in Africa. Over the 14 years I lived there, I lived mainly in the desert, and so a lot of my work was literally water production, trying to bring water to villages that didn't have any water. And so I was involved in maybe 10, 15 water projects over the course of 14 years. And the vast bulk of them were really successful. But there were two that were very, very unsuccessful, and I want to mention these two, because they became a metaphor for me. One project in which we had managed to pipe water for 8 miles, and each project took almost 2 years. Between beginning, we would survey the place, appeal for foreign aid, have people come and vet it, start digging, finding the pipes, laying it down, creating the faucets, all that kind of stuff. It normally took about 2 years to completion. And we had completed one project and won water for 8 miles into a village. And on a Sunday morning, there's a ceremonial turning on of the tap by the chief, and he turns on the tap, and nothing happens. 2 years' work, and not a drop of water. And we go back along the line is just barely covered, just sand in the desert, to find out that somebody, a warrior from another tribe who didn't get a water project, literally traversed the length of the pipe, it's just PVC piping, and just jabbed his spear in it every pace. And the water is pouring out all over. Now that reminded me of the fact that pipes are like the systems or the organizations or the institutions. If they're leaky, even if the water is good, it does not get to the consumer. And therefore, we have to create and transform institutions and organizations and models if we're going to deliver the water of God's grace to the consumers. The second project was the project in which another 8 miles, we piped it for about 8 miles into the village perfectly. And on the morning of the opening, the chief turns on the tap and the water flows copiously. And everybody begins to drink it and splash it, and the animals come and start drinking from it. And 2 days later, everybody in the village is down with dysentery, because we were taking it from a source which was polluted and we didn't realize it. And that represented for me the fact that even if the water pipes are perfect, even if the institutions and the organizations are perfect, the people who staff them have to be transformed themselves. If you pipe water through perfect pipes and the water itself is contaminated, the consumer gets poisoned. And so the transformation is twofold. It is a transformation of systems and models, and it's a transformation of individual people. That's my first point. Second point then I want to look at specifically what would be some of the spiritual practices that we as individuals might engage in order to be part of the solution to this planetary crisis of our times. And the first one I call self-monitoring. And to begin this, I want to tell you again of a very powerful vision I had many, many years ago, in which I saw a vision of a pregnant woman, and I could see her in profile, very hugely pregnant. And as I saw her, I could see right into her belly. And I realized that I was watching the universe. The mother was the universe, and the baby was planet Earth. And at some stages, the mother would look really kind of wan and listless and sickly. And other stages, she looked vibrant and alive and vital. And I began to see that there wasn't just one umbilical cord connecting the baby to the mother. There were 6 billion umbilical cords. Now, umbilical cord has 2 functions. It delivers food to the baby from the mother, and it extracts toxins from the baby via the mother. And so as I was watching this, it seemed to me that when I looked closely at the umbilical cords, sometimes there was crystalline, pure liquid flowing through it, and then the mother was really alive and vibrant. And other stages, it was really gunky and thick and like molasses, and then she was listless and wan. And I began to realize that this gunk that was coming through was the thoughts and the words and the actions of all 6.5 billion on the planet. That we literally create, it's like we create the uterus, or we create the placenta and the umbilical cord in which we live. A little bit like Tyler Desjardins' notion of the noosphere, the sheath of consciousness which surrounds our planet. We're feeding into that, and we're feeding from that. And we're eliminating sometimes our toxins through our thoughts, through our words, and through our actions. And therefore, we have to be really, really careful in monitoring the thoughts we think, and the words we speak, and the actions we engage in. And all the great teachers will tell us this. The Buddha said very famously, 2,500 years ago, he said, you want to know who you are, what kind of a person you are? Listen to yourself speak. You are what you say. If the words you speak are words of compassion and love and tolerance, that's who you are. If the words you speak are words of prejudice and hatred and anger, that is who you are. You want to be different? Change what you're saying. If you find that you've been somebody who's speaking words of prejudice and anger, instead speak words of compassion and love and tolerance, and you become that kind of person. So in a sense, the words we speak are the greatest self-diagnostic tool we have, and they're the greatest psychotherapeutic intervention we have. We are what we say, and we become what we say. So monitoring my words and speaking words which are about love and compassion and tolerance, I become that kind of person. So it's the most important spiritual exercise in the book. And the other most important spiritual exercise in the book is monitoring my thoughts. It's the single most important spiritual exercise I can engage in. Because thoughts create. And I'm not talking about just stray thoughts that come into my mind. I'm talking about thoughts that come in and I entertain them with regularity, and I go back to them again and again, and I put intensity and I put focus into them. Those thoughts manifest, either in a subsequent stage of this life, or in a future incarnation, or in a parallel universe right now. But they will manifest. And this is why Jesus Christ will say, you will be held accountable for every idle thought. He's not talking about God as some kind of a cosmic CPA that's keeping score and books. It's not that. Christ is saying, thoughts, words, and deeds, they literally create a vibrational frequency which radiates out to all other beings in the cosmos. We are all affected by the vibrational frequency of the thoughts and the words and the deeds of others. We have a huge influence. You know the notion of a meme. A meme is to a culture what a gene is to a body. So the body is composed of genes, and the culture is composed of memes. Memes are created by our thoughts, by our words, and by our actions. This is what builds our culture. The thoughts we have, the words we speak, and the actions we engage in. And this is the cynicism of propaganda, because propagandists know that if you can get people thinking the same thoughts and speaking the same words and acting in the same way, and you can get them to do this as a group, then you really amplify the effect. So it becomes very important that we realize that as well. That is, by bringing our thoughts into alignment with love, and our words into alignment with compassion, and our deeds into alignment with mindfulness, then and only then will we see a solution to this kind of global crisis. We have it in our hands. You watch a father pushing a little child on a swing, and there's an art form to it. You have to know when to push. If you push too soon as the child is coming back, you interrupt the periodicity and it won't flow properly. If you push too late and the swing has gone away from you, you have no effect in amplifying it. But if you push at exactly the right time, you can amplify the swing. You get the child to do a loop-de-loop if you want to do that. That is what we do through our thoughts and our words and our actions. When they're in sync with each other, they amplify the result hugely. And therefore having people thinking loving thoughts and speaking loving words and acting in a loving fashion together in groups has a huge effect. The transcendental meditation people have a formula. They claim that if you could get the square root of 1% of the world's population in the same physical location, meditating at the same time, you would affect a global change for a period of time. Now, the strange thing is, the square root of 1% of the world population is a little over 8,000 people. Little over 8,000 people. And they claim to have done that on 2 occasions, once in the Netherlands and once in a university in Iowa. So where you get a group of people together, and Christ is saying this, where there are 2 or 3 people together, it's not just our togetherness that creates Christ consciousness, it's the quality of our thinking, it's the quality of our speaking, and it's the quality of our acting. And then we have this extraordinary effect. That's my second point. My third point then is the practice of the present moment. A few weeks ago I spoke about my belief system that it is not particularly helpful, in fact it's meaningless, to talk about stuff as being good or evil, or something being lucky or unlucky. There is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so, said Shakespeare. Out beyond right doing and out beyond wrong doing, there is a field. I will meet you there, said Rumi. And so ascribing categories to our experiences is totally meaningless. It doesn't help us at all. The only response is, what do I do with it? So the practice of the present moment for me is, I have to accept the situation in which I find myself. Whether this is a personal situation, an interpersonal situation, a community situation, or a global situation. I have to work with what I have. I have to accept it. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it. I have to accept it, and I've got to work with it from there. That is the way forward. Now, unfortunately, most of us, we hijack the present moment, and we give it away to the future through anxiety and through fear. Or we hijack the present moment, and we give it away to the past through guilt and through anger. Almost none of us resides in the present moment, utilizing the present moment for what it was intended, to grow. Now, it's an appropriate use of the present moment to plan for the future or to review the past and learn from the past. But I can't live in the past, and I can't live in the future. I have to live in the now, responding with love to the present configuration of circumstances. And in my experience, nothing upsets us more or throws us off balance and takes us out of the present moment as much as anxiety does. And so there's an exercise I propose regularly to my own clients in my own psychology practice. I call it quality worry time. Most of us are unconsciously worrying constantly about stuff that might happen or could happen in the future. And I say to them, take a half hour out every day and take a piece of paper and a pencil and write down what you're worried about. And write down some things you can do about it. And what you'll find at the end of a month, you're worried about the same things today that you were worried about a month ago. And you know what? You've survived a month and they didn't happen. And so by recording it, it gives us perspective. And because we give quality time to brainstorming around it, we arrive at solutions. It means that the unconscious doesn't have to keep pulling at us constantly. So the practice of the present moment is really, really important. Living totally in the now. Which brings me to my fourth point. Nature as our greatest teacher. When Christ talked today about looking at the lilies of the field and the birds of the heaven, he wasn't saying, take time out, distract yourself, get away from the vicissitudes and the difficulties of life, and just take time out in nature. You'll feel a lot better. He's not just saying that. That's one of the side effects of it, but that's not the purpose of it. Christ is saying, I want you to really look at what nature does. And when you look at nature, it is by far our greatest teacher. It's the oldest teacher. There is no avatar older on planet Earth than nature herself. And when we watch what nature does, she teaches us at least 4 important kinds of lessons. Nobody practices the present moment like nature practices the present moment. And the first great lesson is resilience. Nature never gives up. This was born upon me one day when I was living up in the forest. I was living in an old cabin which had a very, very leaky roof. It was leaking in 40 different places. And so I replaced the roof. And I'm putting shingles on the roof, and I'm cutting the shingles at the end and throwing them on the ground. And then when it was finished after about 4 or 5 days, I gathered up all the shingles to take them away. At least I thought I'd gathered them all up. But about a month later, I discovered one was lying in tall grass. And I said, it's going to be just dead earth underneath this. And I picked it up, and there was tall green grasses growing every place else. Underneath it, there was a totally different kind of ecological system had developed. The grass was yellow, but there were mushrooms coming up, and there were beetles I had seen no place else except under that. So nature didn't give up and say, oh my God, he threw a shingle on top of me. That's it, I give up. I said, okay, I got a shingle to work with. How do I work with a shingle? I got beetles, I got mushrooms, and we can make a go of this. Nature never gives up. So we watch nature work, it never gives up. Its resilience is really, really extraordinary. That's the first lesson we get from nature. A second one is to look at the fact that in spite of what we've been told, nature does not basically operate in tooth and claw. It's not survival of the fittest, and it's not competition for resources. That's only a tiny part of the equation. Mostly, nature operates through symbiosis and through cooperation at every level. Interspecial, you watch a great redwood tree and you look at the fungi at the base of it. And the redwood tree is giving spare chlorophyll down to the roots to the fungi who have no sunlight and can't access chlorophyll. And the fungi are giving nitrogen to the redwood tree. There's this extraordinary symbiotic cooperative gesture where they're working in tandem with each other. A third thing we learn from nature is that it finds the most elegant of solutions to very difficult problems. It invented Occam's razor. It finds this simplest solution to problems. You watch water coming down a mountainside and flowing through plains and finding its way to the sea. It doesn't go the straightest route, it goes the best route. It knows exactly where to curve, where to give way, when to bend, when to double back on itself, and when to go straight. It knows exactly the optimal route to go. Very, very elegant, very simple. In Africa, one of the things I was involved in besides water production was road making. We were trying to make just roads that we could bring trucks in to deliver goods to people. And whenever we were building roads, and they were just built with pickaxes, we're not talking about heavy equipment here, pickaxes and shovels, what we would do is we would send off a herd of goats ahead and watch where the goats went, particularly if they were climbing a mountainside. The goats didn't go straight up, and they didn't go the easiest way. They went the best way. And we would follow their tracks, and we'd make the road follow the track. They knew exactly what the optimal route up this particular terrain was. Not the straight one, not the easiest one, the optimal one. Nature does that in spades. It always finds the most elegant of solutions. And then, paradoxically, it will spend millions of years just flagrantly and excellently, profligately. It will create all kinds of flowers, the most ridiculous kinds of flowers you've ever seen in your life, the most extraordinary colors. Did you ever look at fish, the shapes and the sizes of fish, just for the sheer heck of it? And sometimes, just out of a sense of humor, it'll invent stuff like the hippopotamus. Doesn't seem to work at all. It seems to be like something created by a committee. But God does it just for the sheer fun of doing stuff. So we learn those 4 lessons from nature. So if we're looking at solutions to the problems of our times and our crises, the single most important thing we can do is spend time in nature. For thousands and thousands of years, we have ravished nature, we've despoiled it, we've seen it as a resource that's there just for human consumption. When Jesus Christ said today, look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the heaven, he wasn't saying, I want you now to see nature as just an intellectual resource that you can plagiarize. Rather, he was saying, it is your teacher. Watch it. And when he says, look at the birds of the heaven, or look at the lilies of the field, he wasn't just saying, give a glance here, learn something here. He was saying, I really want you to look.